Hi there, I'm Scott Miller. I'm a member of the support and engineering team here at MyWorkDrive. I want to talk to you a little bit about SMB file locking and how MyWorkDrive interoperates with file locking and also the file locking that's built into MyWorkDrive. I want to start this conversation with a little bit of a primer on how SMB file locking works in general. That'll help anyone who's not already familiar with a base understanding of the valuable advantages in MyWorkDrive interoperating with SMB file locking. We'll talk a little bit about how file locking works in MyWorkDrive itself without regard to SMB file shares. And of course, how MyWorkDrive interacts with SMB file locking. Talk a little bit about non-SMB Windows shares. So they're still SMB, but they're not Windows. And we'll talk about the challenges of syncing and remote work with syncing and how MyWorkDrive could be a replacement that solves some problems with file syncing. And we'll talk a little bit about co-authoring with MyWorkDrive in Office 365. That's an advantage that MyWorkDrive enables you to have, is co-authoring without moving your data to SharePoint. And finally, we'll talk about MyWorkDrive with non-SMB storage. So not Windows file shares, but not SMB storage at all. OneDrive, SharePoint, and some other options. So let me start off with the environment we're working with today. Here in my environment, I have this MyWorkDrive server. Scott 5 is our MyWorkDrive server with a number of file shares. We're going to look at locks and sessions on this as user activities go on. I've got a file server. We're going to look at the SMB activities here on this file server. And I've got just a Windows client. We're going to sign into MyWorkDrive here on this Windows client as a user so we can generate some of that activity. Now let's start off just with file locks on SMB. Let's ignore MyWorkDrive for a few minutes. If you have a Windows file server with file shares on it, which is what I have here, I have a number of file shares on this machine, and it will show you the open files that you have. Now, here's the user Scott, has the share open. You don't have any actual files open, that's just the share itself. And what I wanted to show you is if I go ahead and browse to that share as a user, then I open up a file. I have this file open now. What you'll see on the file server is file locks, right? I've got a lock on the temp file. It's the owner file that Office creates, and then I've got a lock on that file itself. So if some other user were to come in here and want to edit this file, you'll see that's a read-write file. They would be able to. They'd get that familiar message, hey, this file is in use. And of course, if my user closes that file, closes out of that folder, and we take a look at Windows file sharing, you'll see those read and write locks go away. Now, Scott might have this file open somewhere else. That's not a concern for us right now. It's just a read file, and it's on a folder itself or on a share itself. It's not an individual file. So SMB does file locking, right? That's how SMB and Windows file shares have always worked. Now, if I'm over here as a user and I sign in to MyWorkDrive, and I'm going to sign in as a different user, not Scott, because we've just used Scott on our SMB share. So I want to sign in as a different user. As I mentioned, this server has a number of file shares on it already. We have this message about some DLP or some data leak prevention restrictions on some shares. We're not concerned about that today. We're just concerned about this MyWorkDrive folder, which is that same set of shares you saw me open a minute ago on SMB. You'll see I'm just here, I'm browsing, I've not done any activities. If we come back over here, Samantha has a couple of reads. That's Windows in the background opening those files to read metadata. That's totally fine. If you refresh, they go away. Normal activity, and there isn't really a lock there. But if Samantha were to open a file to edit it, now it doesn't matter if we open it in local Office, right? Edit in local app. We've got that edit local app option, which spins up Word or Excel or whatever on your desktop, or you edit it in Office Online. Let's go ahead and edit that same project manager file in Office Online. This is going to pass us over to Office 365. What you'll see here is, as that loads up, you'll see that on our file server, we get locks. Samantha has that file locked for editing. There's our file that we're going to edit. Now, if another user, let's go back to the server and let's go back to that in SMB. Now here we're not using MyWorkDrive. We're just using a regular, local user. If another user, this is Scott trying to open it, tried to open that file, they get that very familiar message, hey, the file's already in use. But this is that other user is on MyWorkDrive, and you know that because we did that, right, as part of the video. But we can also go to the MyWorkDrive server itself, and let's go ahead and close out of being an SMB user. Let's go into the MyWorkDrive admin interface, and let's look at locks and sessions. Now, we don't talk about these a lot in our documentation because most of the time you don't ever need to work with them. But sessions will show you who's signed into MyWorkDrive. Now, Samantha is our only MyWorkDrive user. We did that, right? We did it on the web. We signed into Scott 5. Machine name is relevant if you have multiple servers, say cluster type scenario or something of that nature. And of course, username. And if we needed to terminate Samantha's session, Samantha called and said, oh yeah, I'm in a train, or I've left for the day, or whatever, like we could do that, but we don't need to do that. But what I want to look at is file locks. Now, we open this file, right? We have that file open over here as a client. So Samantha has a file lock on that file. So that's basically the first 3 bullet points that I talked about. Number 1, that how SMB file locking works in and of itself. Users open a file, they get a lock on SMB. How file locking works in MyWorkDrive. User opens a file, they have a, user signs in, they get a session. User opens a file, they have a lock on that file here. And then how does MyWorkDrive work with SMB? Well, you see that Samantha has that file open. Samantha has a lock on that file. Scott has some handles open as well. And Scott, and as a user coming from on-prem or VPN or RDS or something of that nature, right? Scott, as a user, local user, we'll call, can't get to that file because Samantha has that file open and locked via MyWorkDrive. Of course, if Samantha exits the file, let's close that out here, you'll see that MyWorkDrive gets a notice that we're releasing that file from editing. Now, this process takes a little bit because in the case of editing in Office Online, you need a chance for Office Online to write that file back to the file server, right? If you can watch our video or read our documentation on how Office Online editing works, but there's a temp file that's created out on either OneDrive or SharePoint, depending on how you configure your Office Online editing, and that file gets edited, written back. That takes a little bit of time. But what you'll see is once that process completes on the MyWorkDrive server, if you refresh, this lock will disappear. In this case, again, this is Samantha. And you'll see on your file server itself, that lock will disappear as soon as that write-back process completes. So I hit refresh here. You'll notice that my file lock has gone away. I go back to shares. Of course, Samantha still has her session open. If we take a look at the file share and I click refresh there, of course, Samantha's stuff is gone. So that's all gone now. You'll see we had a lock here. If we refresh, that lock goes away. Okay, that's sort of how MyWorkDrive works, file locking and that sort of thing. Now, talk about non-Windows SMB shares. Things like a NAS appliance, or a Samba share on some variant of Linux, or a SAN like an EMC or a NetApp, Isilon, some enterprise product. As long as those products, and of course the others, there are other things out there like the Moro Datas of the world. As long as those products understand file locks, like what you see on the file server, then you'll interoperate just fine. MyWorkDrive, again, these things just no file locks there. MyWorkDrive will issue that lock on that file when the user has it open, as long as the application of the storage understands file locking, you'll be fine for non-Windows SMB shares. Now, a common problem that customers run into as they enable remote work is they'll try to use file syncing between physical locations. So you've got, say, an office in San Francisco and you've got an office in London. And you're using a sync product behind the scenes. Could be commercial sync product, could be something you've written in a script. If that sync doesn't account for locks, you run into the potential problem of a collision and something that you have to resolve, right? Multiple versions of the file, because your user in San Francisco could open a file and edit it. That file is synced to London. The user in London doesn't get a lock because locks don't sync. They open the file, they make an edit. Now you've got multiple files to deal with. MyWorkDrive could be a solution for that kind of problem, because with MyWorkDrive, as I noted, when a user opens a file, let me reopen this project tracker for editing so we have a lock here. You get that lock in MyWorkDrive, right? That lock is here, and if we come over here to our server, now we've got a lock on the Excel file. You've got a lock. So if all of your users are attached to MyWorkDrive in some storage that's appropriate. It might be you just have a few users in London and the majority of your users are in San Francisco, so your MyWorkDrive server is in San Francisco alongside the file share and the bulk of the users. Or it could be you put this infrastructure in the cloud and everyone accesses remotely. Or it could be you put it in some neutral, middle ground, somewhere on the east coast of the United States or somewhere in, say, Iceland, something of that nature. Then, of course, users who are all accessing via MyWorkDrive, you've eliminated the concern of synced files. You've eliminated the people going to the files directly, and you're just dependent on MyWorkDrive and its file locking. Now, doing that also lets you co-edit or co-author, as it's called, with Office 365. Because even though this file is on a file share in San Francisco or on the East Coast or in London, or what happens is that local file in, say, San Francisco gets moved to the cloud, gets moved to your edit storage location, and everyone edits from there. And so if another user wants to come in on Office 365, another person signs in via MyWorkDrive, Scott signs in on MyWorkDrive, or Jason signs in on MyWorkDrive, and also wants to edit this project tracker file, well, they could go alongside Samantha in the cloud and edit it. So even though that file is stored on your file server locally, you can see co-editing and you can do co-authoring that way. So that's potentially an advantage that's enabled by MyWorkDrive and works with the file locking that's in MyWorkDrive, because MyWorkDrive is aware of the files that it has open. It's aware of the files that are open and locked. Now the last question that gets asked is, well, what about non-SMB storage? In 6.4, we enabled OneDrive and SharePoint shares. You'll see I have OneDrive shares. I think when during page 2, I've got some SharePoint share. Those shares are not SMB. They don't do file locking the same way. In fact, SharePoint doesn't do really file locking at all. Why? Because it doesn't need file locking. It supports co-authoring, right? Well, what if you have a mixed environment? What if you have some users attaching via MyWorkDrive? What do you have some users coming in on VPN? What happens there? Well, if you don't have a MyWorkDrive type scenario, you can end up with those same collisions and that same conflict resolution that we talked about a minute ago. But if you're using MyWorkDrive, you get file locks in the same way on shares that you would for an SMB share on SharePoint or OneDrive path. And you get that same ability to do co-editing. That's 6.4. We introduced OneDrive and SharePoint. Version 7, we're introducing other types of Azure Cloud Storage. We're supporting Azure Files via its storage API, and we're also supporting Azure Blob. Now, we've long supported Azure Files, I don't know, going back to version 6, I think, with their SMB, with the SMB integration of Azure Files, and that's just an SMB connection. But with version 7, we're enabling that via API, and we're doing that because of performance. The SMB implementation of Azure Files is a little slow. Of course, you got cloud components in there, all those things, though that stuff adds latency. And because we did Azure Files, we've also done Azure Blob. A lot of customers are starting to look at Blob. They like the idea of granularity with Blob, with Data Lake Gen 2, the ability to get down to an access control list, an ACL, and get down to file and folder level NTFS style permissioning, which doesn't exist if you're doing Azure Files just out of the box, or you're doing blob, just raw blob storage without, like I say, that Data Lake Gen 2. When you go to that, now, of course, if you're connecting to your Azure file share and you're just mounting it over the web, you've got 445 open, or you're using a VPN, you have no file locking, because Azure Files without that SMB component doesn't natively do file locking, and of course Blob doesn't do file locking. But with MyWorkDrive, you introduce MyWorkDrive, and now not only do you have an access point for Azure Files and Azure Blob that makes it easy for users to interface with, gives them the ability to have those familiar map drives and that sort of thing, but also supports file locking, record locking. So user comes in on a MyWorkDrive share, on the web, on the map drive client, they open up a file and folder, they edit a Word document, there's a lock there which MyWorkDrive sees. And if another user comes in my example, Samantha has a file open, Scott comes in on the other side, opens that file. That file is going to be locked. So now we're storage agnostic when it comes to record locking and the ability to do native, sort of familiar, comfortable type Windows file locking, but without being dependent on Windows file shares. That's the real advantage of the MyWorkDrive software, is the ability to have that record locking with a native Windows type feel without having to worry about your storage source. So if I may, I'd like to take just a moment and step through a quick recap of what we talked about on this video. We started off with an overview of SMB file locking, just how file locking works in Windows is a foundation for how MyWorkDrive interoperates with SMB seamlessly, placing locks on SMB, respecting the locks of SMB users. You saw where I attempted to open a file that the Samantha user in MyWorkDrive had open in Office 365 with a desktop user, just an on-prem user in desktop Office, and how that warned us in the traditional Windows sense that file was currently in use. Took a look in the software at how MyWorkDrive keeps track of locks and sessions for active MyWorkDrive events users and how you can operate with those, being able to terminate them or being able to release a lock if you need to. We talked about MyWorkDrive as an alternative or replacement for syncing, where you can avoid the syncing failure of not syncing those locks and those collisions and having to deal with version conflicts. We talked about co-authoring with MyWorkDrive and how MyWorkDrive enables Office 365 co-authoring without, or co-editing without needing to be in SharePoint. I'll keep your files in SharePoint. And finally, we talked about how MyWorkDrive is a record locking or a file locking opportunity for non-SMB storage that doesn't do record locks. OneDrive, SharePoint, Azure Files, Azure Blob, that sort of thing. If you have any questions about file locking, record locking, MyWorkDrive, file shares, how any of that works, want to discuss your scenario with us, you're welcome to. You can visit us at myworkdrive.com/support, or if you're looking for some of those articles that I mentioned, things about how our Office integration works or how those different types of file shares work, SMB or non-SMB file storage. You can also email us directly. Just email support@myworkdrive.com. We'll be happy to chat with you about your scenario, how MyWorkDrive might work for you, how you might use it better, how we can work together to solve your problems. Again, thank you for your time on this video. See you in the next one.